Thanks, Kristen, for the presentation earlier. I hope if you have not yet done so that you'll stop by our old prayer room, which is now the sensory room, just around the corner there in the hallway. It's been outfitted to be a sensory room so that those with autism can go in there and kind of calm down, be comforted and soothed. It's a great place for folks. Nathan has already discovered it and enjoys it. So stick your head in and take a look at it today if you can. All right, we are working our way through Exodus here this summer. We're camping in one section when the Lord directs and then moving on when He moves. Today we're covering several chapters out of the book of Exodus, not in detail, of course, but thematically. We're going to touch on all 10 of the plagues and see where it gets us. So buckle up. So the passage that was just read, Exodus 6:28 through 7:7, sets the stage for the plagues that will follow in chapters 7 through 12. Moses, again, makes excuses for why he's not the right guy for the mission that God has called him to. And God, once again, corrects Moses, telling him that he, God, will use him in a mighty way. That God will make Moses like God to Pharaoh, and Aaron shall be your prophet. That's in verse 1 of chapter 7. But then God says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, which doesn't mean that God is pulling puppet strings like some kind of stage show. It's just the way the people thought and spoke back then. Everything that happened was deemed God's doing, even though Pharaoh had his own mind and his own free will. When it says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, it means the same thing as Pharaoh's heart will be hardened. Do you catch the difference? I will harden Pharaoh's heart means the same thing as Pharaoh's heart will be hardened. God knew that Pharaoh would continually change his mind and not let the Israelites leave Egypt. Foreknowledge is not the same thing as compulsion. And God says that ultimately, finally, Pharaoh will let the people go when God lays his hand upon Egypt. In other words, when the last straw breaks the camel's back, he will wear Pharaoh down until he finally relents and lets them go. So Moses and Aaron do what the Lord commands them. And oh, by the way, Moses was 80 years old and Aaron was 83. So don't you tell me that you're too old to be in ministry. So the 10 plagues. We know something about plagues, don't we? The COVID-19 pandemic was and is a plague. Plagues affect everyone or nearly everyone. We all have either had COVID or we know someone who has, and many of us know someone who has died of COVID. It's an earth-changing plague. We already are counting time as before the pandemic and after the pandemic, even though the virus continues to rage in some places, including another uptick here in Orange County. But our plague and the plagues of Egypt are of two different sorts, or at least I think so. At this point, it isn't clear that the COVID plague was sent by God to punish us or to teach us anything. But we may look back at it and discern the hand of God more clearly in the future. But at this point, we're just glad that we survived to this point. In some sense, Pharaoh had a similar take. With each succeeding plague's end, Pharaoh relented and returned to his stubborn refusal to let the people of Israel go. The first sign or miracle is not a plague at all, but the rod into snake miracle that Moses had practiced before. And it failed to impress Pharaoh because his sorcerers were able to duplicate it. However, the snake from Moses' rod gobbled up the snakes from the sorcerer's rod, showing that God's miracle is still greater. The second sign is the first of the 10 plagues in chapter 7, verses 14 through 25. And again, it is the one that Moses had practiced before coming to Pharaoh, turning water into blood and thus making the water unusable. We can contrast that with Jesus turning water into wine, which made it very useful indeed at the wedding in Cana of Galilee. But the sorcerers were again able to duplicate, so Pharaoh was not impressed. The second plague was of frogs in chapter 8, verses 1 through 15. One wonders if the frogs left the water because it had turned into blood. And while Pharaoh's sorcerers were able to duplicate, clearly Pharaoh was becoming a bit annoyed, and he introduces a theme that will be repeated many times, asking Moses to pray to the Lord to take away the frogs from me and my people. And he promises then to let the people go to sacrifice to the Lord in verse 8. So Moses does pray, and God does remove the frogs. But it says, when Pharaoh saw that there was a respite, he hardened his heart and would not listen to them, just as the Lord had said, in verse 15. The third plague was that of gnats. Love this one. Chapter 8, verses 16 through 19, a short passage which shows the sorcerers of Pharaoh's court to be frustrated that they could not duplicate this sign. And so they confess to Pharaoh in verse 19, this is the finger of God, which is kind of what we do, isn't it? If science can explain something, we accept the explanation. But if science can't explain something, we say it must be God. Science, you see, is our modern form of sorcery. We define miracle as something that science cannot explain, be honest, which is foolish, because God created science too. We can explain the sun rising each morning scientifically, but it is still a miracle to those of us with the eyes of faith. But no doubt about it, gnats are terribly irritating. The fourth plague, flies, chapter 8, verses 20 through 32. I kind of consider the flies to be an obvious outcome of having mounds of decaying frogs all over the place. But whatever the reason, this plague gets Pharaoh into a negotiating mood. So he tries to get Moses to have the Israelites do their sacrificing within Egypt. And Moses rejects this because if they do the sacrifices so that the Egyptians can see, then they will be offended. So Pharaoh says they can go, but not too far, verse 28. So Moses prayed, and God removed the flies, and you know what happens. Pharaoh hardens his heart again and refused to let the people go. The fifth plague, livestock dying, chapter 9, verses 1 through 7. And just like with the flies, the livestock in Goshen, where the Israelites lived, did not die. God protected their livestock just as he spared them of the flies. And to demonstrate that God's hand was at work, not a single animal of the Israelites died. But Pharaoh still hardened his heart. The plague of boils is the sixth plague, definitely my least favorite. Chapter 9, verses 8 through 12. This plague resembles the gnats in that it results from Moses throwing stuff up in the air. But this one takes out the sorcerers, the magicians, so that they could, it says, no longer stand before Moses, verse 11. And it's a prequel to the final plague, where both humans and animals are affected by the boils. The seventh plague, hail, chapter 9, verses 13 through 35. This one is in more detail, and it emphasizes that it is the Lord's power that is doing this to demonstrate his sovereignty. This was not Moses or Aaron's doing, it was the Lord's. And then the eighth plague, locusts, chapter 10, verses 1 through 20. This one is notable because Pharaoh's officials try to persuade Pharaoh to relent and let the people go. The officials apparently were convinced of God's power, not determination. God's power and determination, but not Pharaoh. He was not convinced. Pharaoh tries again to negotiate by letting only the men of Israel go. And Moses, of course, rejects this compromise, so Pharaoh digs in again and refuses to let them go. The ninth plague, darkness, chapter 10, verses 21 through 29. This being the next to the last of the plagues, it is a bit dramatic. And at the end, Pharaoh's hatred of Moses is revealed, and he threatens that if Moses returns, he will die. Moses calls his bluff, and the stage is set for the final and deciding plague, the death of the firstborn. Chapter 11, verses 1 through 10. This is not the plague itself, just the announcement of the final plague is coming. And God reveals to Moses what he is going to do. And he says that this will finally do the trick, and Pharaoh will let the people go. It is something so horrible that it is hard for us to comprehend the horror. All firstborn boys among humans and animals would die. So every household in Egypt would suffer, including Pharaoh's household itself. It's hard to imagine our loving God doing something like this. Yet these were desperate times, and God had to do what God had to do to show the world what was what. So he gave detailed instructions on how to protect the Israelites from this plague and to prepare to depart Egypt for the wilderness journey for which they would be released. So that's a fast look at the 10 plagues of Egypt. So what? What does this have to do with us? It's an interesting history lesson, perhaps. But what do we learn from this episode in history? In some ways, it shows how stubborn the human heart is, how people can dig their heels in and refuse to change their minds, especially once pride gets in the way. Pharaoh's sin is essentially pride. He doesn't want to appear weak or un-Pharaoh-like, so he refuses to give in, ostensibly in order to show strength. But what results is disaster for Egypt and for Pharaoh himself. God, on the other hand, will not be shown up. If we want to fight against God, the story shows us that we will lose eventually. And all powers, civil and ecclesiastical, will likewise lose in any struggle against God. It may take a while, but it will happen. God's people will be set free. It may indeed take a long while. The Israelites had no idea that their liberation would not be consummated until after most of them were gone, that it would be their children who would be the inheritors of the promised land. It would take 40 years of wandering before it actually happened. And that's not to say that it will always take that long, but we need to be prepared for it nevertheless. In our contest with the powers that be, it may take a while before we are truly free to worship in the ways our God is calling us. But let us not squander our opportunity, and let us not fall into temptation to sin, thus extending our wanderings. Let us keep our eyes on Jesus. Hebrews 12, verses 1 and 2 says this: "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the sake of the joy that was set before him endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God." Next week, we get into part 6 of this journey through Exodus, and I'd like for you to read Exodus chapter 14, verses 21 through 31. Exodus 14, 21 through 31. Now let's spend a few moments in silent reflection as we consider what God may be speaking to our hearts today.